Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Kiorkof, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about sleeper wide receivers for the 2020 fantasy football season. Today, we're going to be talking about 4 different wide receivers who, in my opinion, are absolute steals going into the 2020 fantasy football season. These 4 different prospects are, without a doubt, being undervalued in your drafts. Guys that you can be drafting after the 10th plus round. These wide receivers were incredible in the 2019 season, yet a lot of people are undervaluing them or outright ignoring them as we approach the 2020 season. So we're going to talk about these 4 potential sleepers. And yes, there are a bunch of other sleeper wide receivers. So when I mention these 4, I don't want to see you guys down in the comment section complaining that I didn't cover a different wide receiver. There are going to be a bunch of different sleeper wide receiver videos as we get closer to the 2020 season. So trust me, the ones that you're thinking of, I'm also thinking of, and we'll talk about them in the coming weeks and days. Again, before we begin, reminder, August 10th, huge day. We're going to be releasing Andrew Kiorkof's 2020 Fantasy Football Draft Guide. More information on that in the coming days. Besides my different draft strategies for the wide receiver, running back, quarterback, and tight end positions, it'll include my rankings by tier at position, my top 100 flex rankings, all that kind of stuff. But again, more information and details in a deeper level will be divulged in the coming days and weeks. Regardless, subscribe to the channel. More content coming your way every single day until the 2020 season begins. So let's talk about the top 4 wide receivers that we wanted to mention today. Again, I could have made specific videos like player profile videos like I'll do later today with Calvin Ridley for these guys, but I didn't really find that these guys needed their individual, shining light. Yes, I really do believe that these 4 potential players can play huge roles on your teams, especially as bench wide receivers or wide receiver 3s. But I don't think they're, the flashy names. That's why they're sleepers. All right, starting off with my number 1 wide receiver here, talking about Jamison Crowder of the New York Jets. Jamison Crowder played 16 total games last season in which he produced 122 targets, 78 receptions, 833 receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns, all for 158.7 fantasy points. Now, the thing that a lot of people are going to forget about is the fact that Jamison Crowder had 3 different weeks there with a bum at quarterback. Unfortunately, Sam Darnold did miss a significant amount of time last season due to the injury, quote unquote, sickness that he had. And that definitely played a huge role. In the 13 games that Jamison Crowder played with Sam Darnold, he averaged 11.32 fantasy points per game and had a 27.66% target share within the Jets offense. That's absolutely ridiculous, and these are numbers that cannot be ignored. You want to talk about some other numbers that can't be ignored? Out of all wide receivers last season to surpass 110 targets, 22 of them were a part of the top 24 wide receivers. The only 2 top 24 wide receivers of last season in a half PPR scoring format that didn't have over 110 targets were A.J. Brown and Stephon Diggs. Jamison Crowder was a guy, or one of the only 2 players that did not make the top 24 list despite having over 110 targets. Now you may be thinking, why is this relevant? Because Jamison Crowder is very capable and could have potentially been a top 24 wide receiver last season if Darnold had stayed healthy. We'll continue. Of the top 24 wide receivers of last season, 19 of them surpassed 72 total receptions. Guys like Golladay, guys like Stephon Diggs, Mike Evans, they couldn't surpass the 72 reception mark, but guess who did? Jamison Crowder did. He's one of 3 wide receivers who didn't make the top 24 that surpassed 72 receptions and 110 total targets. Last season, he tied for 16th amongst all wide receivers for targets and tied 20th amongst all wide receivers for receptions. These are important stats because opportunity aligning to potential success is always going to be there for Jamison Crowder, and that's going to lead into the 2020 season because he proved that in 2019. Talking about the 8 games last season in which he had 8+ targets, yeah, that's opportunity to say the least. He averaged 14.36 fantasy points per game in those contests. Absolutely beautiful, something we can't ignore again. Besides the fact that I personally called Jamison Crowder the slot machine. Some slots, you pull the little lever, you max bet, and you end up getting screwed over. But to be honest, Jamison Crowder is one of those slot machines it's the lucky machine, and it's going to continue to spit out fantasy points and coins on a weekly basis. Last season, he produced 364 yards after the catch, 10 avoided tackles, which was 8th best amongst all wide receivers in terms of yards after the catch and being able to produce there. Jamison Crowder should not be ignored, and I'll tell you exactly why. If last season, the 11.32 fantasy point per game average he had with Sam Darnold was sustained over a 16-game season, he would have finished as the number 20 wide receiver. Why? Well, like I mentioned earlier, his stats aligned with that. He would have been the number 20 wide receiver, and he'd be drafted far higher than he is right now. His current ADP, I mean, damn, you can steal him in the 9th round easily, and he's your 4th best wide receiver, maybe 5th, depending on how your draft proceeded. Last season, when Sam Darnold returned from injury in week 6, after the mononucleosis that he dealt with in those, in 3 of the first 4 weeks, Jamison Crowder from weeks 6 through 17 finished as the number 15 wide receiver. In the back end of the season, after week 6 on, Jamison Crowder was a top 15 wide receiver, and a lot of people, once again, are ignoring him. Jamison Crowder is one of the best sleeper wide receiver candidates going into the 2020 season. I just thought I'd go ahead and let you guys know, because to be honest, it's valuable information that we should all know. Moving on, let's talk about Hunter Renfrow, Raiders wide receiver and second-year player. Hunter Renfrow was a Clemson graduate, caught the game-winning touchdown as a wide receiver for the Clemson Tigers when Deshaun Watson was there. All in all, Hunter Renfrow is one of the best wide receivers. Last season, he played 13 games. He produced 71 targets, 49 receptions, 605 receiving yards, 4 receiving touchdowns, all for 109 fantasy points. You might look at those numbers and be like, Andrew, you got to be kidding me. We're talking about Hunter Renfrow? Abso-freaking-lutely. And I'll tell you why. Because Hunter Renfrow, after, the rookie season began, some rookies don't end up being like Terry McLaurin, where they come hot out the gate. But Hunter Renfrow was just as good as an A.J. Brown at the back half of the season, yet a lot of people aren't realizing that that's an actual reality. From weeks 8 through 17, Hunter Renfrow averaged 12.93 fantasy points per game. Yes, he missed 3 games in that stretch, and the 8 through 17 is only counting 7 games. Either way, 12.93, those are better numbers than Jamison Crowder was averaging. He had a 20% target share amongst the Raiders last season. On top of it, in the 3 games where he was given ample opportunity of 8+ targets, he had 14.8 fantasy point per game average, similar to a Jamison Crowder, slot receiver, had 331 yards after the catch. Hunter Renfrow also had 10 avoided tackles, which tied 8th with Jamison Crowder amongst all wide receivers. Overall, Hunter Renfrow sits in a pretty interesting situation. A lot of people don't want to draft the Raiders wide receivers. They're trying to ignore the fact that Henry Ruggs exists, Tyrell Williams exists, and Hunter Renfrow, most definitely. All fantasy prospects are pretty much looking at are Darren Waller and Josh Jacobs, and I don't blame them. But the reality of the situation is that Hunter Renfrow is an extremely valuable prospect, and what he was able to produce in the back half of the 2019 season leads me to believe that you can easily have this guy stolen in the late 11th, 12th round and be sitting on your bench, pretty until there are potential matchups where you eventually see Hunter Renfrow starting to pick up his targets, starting to produce on a weekly basis. When you have more talent at the wide receiver position, sure, maybe people are going to think, oh, Henry Ruggs is going to come in and steal targets. To be honest, this Raiders offense throwing the ball 500 times, I'm 100% certain there's enough to go around for a Henry Ruggs, for a Darren Waller, for a Josh Jacobs, and a Hunter Renfrow. I think Renfrow, besides the fact that he's kind of a name that's far less known because he's a younger player, he's just going to be ignored through and through. And if you can go ahead and draft him where he's currently being taken, he might even fall in your respective drafts. I cannot see a reality in which I ignore Hunter Renfrow, and that's why I had to mention him. On top of it, one more stat that I wanted to mention. We talk about his 20.1% target share last season. His target percentage in terms of routes run by targets total, he had 290 total routes run. He had 71 total targets. That made it to where he was targeted on 24.5% of his routes run. These are pretty ridiculous numbers, and I'm glad to see at least Derek Carr's found his new, check down guy. A couple years back, it was Jalen Richard. Now it seems to be Hunter Renfrow in the slot position being his safety blanket, which is fantastic to see, and is fantastic for us in the fantasy football landscape. Moving on, let's talk about the next slot receiver, even though not all these guys are slot receivers, but the first three are. Let's talk about Golden Tate, Giants wide receiver. Golden Tate's a very interesting prospect all in all. I think Golden Tate last year only played 12 games because of the 4-game suspension that he served. Now, despite all of that, 85 targets, 49 receptions, 676 total receiving yards, 6 receiving touchdowns for 127.7 fantasy points. Here's the thing about Golden Tate. Golden Tate, in my opinion, is kind of a sneaky good wide receiver that's kind of hiding in this Giants offense. I mean, if we don't remember, for those of you who don't remember, Golden Tate was a wide receiver too in 3 of the 4 seasons that he was with the Detroit Lions. I mean, yes, the last couple of years, he hasn't been able to produce at the high level that we wanted him to, but that's because of the 4-game suspension he served this last season. In 2018, he was traded midway through the season to the Eagles, who did not utilize him as a Detroit Lion, which was not too far ago. I mean, 2017. He was a wide receiver too, who was absolutely feasting on defenses. I mean, when we looked at what he was able to produce last season in this offense, when he was given the opportunity from weeks 5 through 17, I mean, he produced 10.64 fantasy points per game. A lot of people probably don't think of Golden Tate and think, oh, he's a 10 point per week kind of guy. He's my wide receiver 3. A lot of people probably won't correlate the two because they just didn't have any shares of him last season. Speaking of shares, Golden Tate had a 19.06% target share within the respective offense in the 12 games that he played last season. All in all, Golden Tate was a monster. Despite, yes, he's getting older and the opportunity may not be there on a weekly basis, but last season he had 6 games of 8+ targets, and in those games he averaged 12.43 fantasy points per game. Golden Tate is still a receiver that you can rely upon, and still a guy that in an offense where all the other prospects are coming off the board, Daniel Jones, Saquon Barkley, Evan Ingram, Sterling Shepard, and Darius Slayton are definitely going to pull attention. I mean, Darius Slayton put up 2 29-point performances last year and a half PPR. That's all he did. Sterling Shepard is the number 1 wide receiver for this offense, but he's always injured. Concussions after concussions, hamstring injuries. These are things that have plagued him in the last couple seasons and are going to continue to do so if, in fact, he's not, taking care of himself. Again, concussions, the defense kind of imposes that on you, but again, you can avoid hits, and Sterling Shepard would have to do that. In my opinion, Golden Tate's greatest ability is availability. The fact that he didn't miss a single game last season after he missed a 4-game suspension, he came into this offense, and even with a couple games of playing with Eli Manning, the 2 games that he played with Eli Manning against the Philadelphia Eagles and the Miami Dolphins, he only had 2 receptions in those games. So if in fact we just pretty much averaged out all of the games that he produced with Daniel Jones, he would have averaged 11.45 fantasy points per game. And in those weeks from weeks 5 through 17, Golden Tate was the number 28 overall wide receiver. That's a wide receiver 3. Again, Golden Tate, his best ability is availability, and the fact that he's in the slot position, he's going to get a lot of targets going in his direction. And yes, you may be thinking, Evan Ingram wasn't there last year. Saquon Barkley wasn't healthy last year. The fact that those guys weren't healthy, the targets aren't going to go to Golden Tate because of the fact that these guys are back now. Barkley did not see that many targets with Daniel Jones in comparison to his rookie season with Eli Manning. Eli Manning was far more likely to check down the ball. And if you guys don't remember, go check out how many targets New York Giants tight ends gathered last season. Caden Smith, Rhett Ellison, they still got a bunch of targets last year, even in the absence of Evan Ingram, and they were still great fantasy producers. So go check that out. I personally think that the targets are going to be there for Golden Tate. He's a sleeper. Moving on. Let's talk about our last wide receiver of today, the guy that is literally over my shoulder, Marvin Jones Jr. of the Detroit Lions. Yes, Marvin Jones is a very interesting prospect because he's missed a couple, games here and there in the last couple of years because of the various injuries that have plagued him. But if Marvin Jones can stay healthy, sure, he's not like a Will Fuller where he's getting injured with a hamstring injury and missing 7-8 games a season. Marvin Jones has been a wide receiver 1 before, and just as recently as 2017, when Golden Tate was on the same team hauling in 100+ targets, Marvin Jones was still able to produce very well. Marvin Jones last season, with only 13 games played, had 92 targets, 62 receptions, 779 receiving yards, 9 receiving touchdowns, all for 162.9 fantasy points. From weeks 1 through 9 with Matthew Stafford as the starting quarterback, Marvin Jones averaged 13.86 fantasy points per game. That's absolutely fantastic. You want to know what's even better than that? The fact that from weeks 1 through 9, if I'm not mistaken, Marvin Jones was the number 15 overall wide receiver. He was there. He was consistently producing. And sure, he had one game with 4 touchdowns. But even if you spread that out, Marvin Jones is a deep ball receiver and he's a big body target. He's going to get those receptions. He's going to get those touchdowns, whether it's in 1 week or spread amongst 4. We've seen him do it. Certainly, double-digit touchdowns is not something that is, evaded Marvin Jones throughout his career. He's definitely been a guy to get double-digit touchdowns. And with Matthew Stafford as quarterback, the gunslinger he is, absolutely beautiful. Last season, if we had taken the averages and Matthew Stafford had stayed healthy throughout the entire season, and so did Marvin Jones, Marvin Jones could have potentially had over 1,000 receiving yards, over 10 plus touchdowns, and over 84 receptions, with 130 targets last season. Those numbers are staggering in my opinion, because this is all with the fact that Kenny Golladay was still in this offense and produced as well as he did. All in all, I think, okay, sure, he's been a wide receiver 1 in the past. He has great touchdown upside. His red zone targets, 14 just last season, leading to 8 of his touchdowns. The 9 targets that were inside the 10-yard line led to 5 of his touchdowns. Great. Big body receiver, going to be targeted heavily. Fantastic. Healthy wide receivers around Matthew Stafford are always going to produce, especially if Matthew Stafford consistently stays healthy. On top of it, Marvin Jones, he's going to get his targets. Even though his catch rate has not been as great as we've wanted it to be in the past, he's still going to produce when he's given said opportunity. In the 4 games that he had 8+ targets last year, he averaged 21.77 fantasy points. All in all, as a deep ball receiver, again, 18 targets of over 20 yards, even though Kenny Golladay led the entire league in the wide receiver position with the most deep ball targets last season. Marvin Jones in 13 games had 18, which was 33rd amongst all wide receivers. My opinion, Marvin Jones is set for another good season. A lot of people are sleeping on him. They see his injury history, they're worried about it. They see Matthew Stafford's injury history, they worry about it. They see Kenny Galladay's production, they worry about it. In my opinion, I'm glad to see Marvin Jones not pulling number 1 corner coverage. If Kenny Golladay is going to be the number 1 wide receiver of this team, great. Let him run off with the best corners in the league and let them double cover Kenny Golladay while Marvin Jones ends up producing on the other side of the field. Like I've mentioned before, especially in the prior video, when I talk about wide receiver rankings prior to this season starting, I had Kenny Golladay, I think it was my number 6 wide receiver going into this upcoming season. I talked about the fact that there were some weeks where Marvin Jones completely annihilated Kenny Galladay's value and the opposite wasn't reciprocated. There are times that Marvin Jones is going to produce 10 points while Kenny Golladay pops off for 28. And then there are games where Kenny Golladay disappears and scores 1 point while Marvin Jones scores 19. Marvin Jones is a very sneaky receiver. He's also one of these guys that's a handcuff per se. If Golladay goes down, Marvin Jones becomes a wide receiver 1 of an offense that really doesn't have that many receiving options. I'm excited about the prospect of Marvin Jones this season. I'm excited about the prospect of all 4 of these wide receivers going into this season. And all in all, to be honest, should be a good season with all these different wide receivers being kind of sneakily held. I'm holding my hand. Sure, there are other guys that I want to talk about, and we're going to talk about them in the coming weeks. But thank you everybody for watching. I really do appreciate your consistency and your support. If you like today's video, go down below. I really do appreciate you guys clicking the like button. It helps the videos out a lot. Let me know down in the comment section who are other guys that you think are sleeper wide receivers, because again, I know exactly who you're thinking of, and the videos will be coming down the pipe soon. Either way, thank you everybody for watching. Until next time, which will be the Calvin Ridley video player profile, I'll see you guys. Peace.